in the health sector is that until basically today, there's been almost no funding. And so the research base is incredibly limited. For those of you who went to the health ministerial yesterday, there was an announcement that there's going to be $1 billion put together on climate change and health. And that will help really further this research significantly. This is a figure, as you've now read, on vulnerability in a variety of sectors. You can see vulnerable groups vary from place to place. This is a very important context that health works explicitly on the inequities of a changing climate. This is another that shows a similar figure to what you just saw about hyperthermia, so exposure to high temperatures and shifting over time under different assumptions about temperature change. A challenge in the health sector is few of these projections include urbanization or even demographic change. And so that the reality is likely to be different than these, but they're useful to start preparing for where issues are urgent and immediate. As I mentioned at the beginning, we need to look in the context of other drivers. This is work that was done in Europe. It was looking at actual emerging infectious disease threat events in Europe and used a technique that's used in genetics to look at upstream drivers. It was a unique approach for that analysis to look at what were the key drivers. And when you looked at these actual threat events, the number one upstream driver was travel and tourism. Global trade was also important, and then came climate. After these were all the kinds of traditional surveillance factors we look at in health. And so it was a real strong message to the health sector how important it is to start paying more attention to these upstream drivers, and obviously in our context, pay more attention to climate. This is the overall summary that was put together. Hopefully some of you can see this from the back, looking at vulnerability upstream drivers, the different kinds of exposure pathways, examples, just very few examples of the health outcomes, and then talking about the solution space. One of the places where the health sector is different from other sectors is that we have the World Health Organization, which has regional offices and country offices, and they provide technical guidance to countries. And so we're set up in a very different way. There are no programs that were set up until basically now explicitly incorporating climate. So the major work is explicitly incorporating climate into policies and programs that already exist for the climate sensitive health outcomes. So lots of work to be done, but we're starting in a different place than in other sectors. And as you just heard, one of the key messages we want to bring is that there is enormous benefits for health, not just from adaptation, but from mitigation. And another message, as you see on the right, is we need to think not only about people, but about infrastructure, that our health systems are being affected. Too many healthcare facilities in small island developing states, or even just in smaller islands, are on coastal zones, are susceptible to sea level rise, storm surge, king tides. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done on the hard infrastructure as well. A key issue that came up in the report was mental health. I didn't like the figure in the report, so I'm using this as an example from flooding in the UK, showing 3 years of follow-up after massive flooding, 2013, 2014, and showing for anxiety and post-traumatic stress disorder. As you would expect, there was a huge increase immediately after the event. One of the important elements of this is that the authors separated out people who were unaffected, people who lived in a residence that was disrupted, floodwaters came to the front door but didn't go in, versus people who are actually flooded. And a lot of the health work hasn't made that separation. You can see over time, over the 3 years, there's been a decline in these groups in terms of anxiety and PTSD, and they haven't returned to baseline. So long-term mental health consequences for which really we don't have health services managing this very well yet. You'll hear from others about compounding and cascading risks. This is an example from the heat dome that hit 2 years ago in Canada, the Pacific Northwest, and just showing you the very wide range of consequences. when you have a major event. And I'm not going to go through these, we can discuss these later, but it is quite complex. There's a lot of work that needs to be done to understand how to protect the health and well-being of the different groups of people that are being affected. We produced burning embers as most of the other sectors did. If you need an explanation of burning embers, we can do this later. These are the 6 burning embers that we produced for health. What we did differently than other sectors is we looked at 3 adaptation scenarios. So the ember on the left in each set is a world in which there's limited adaptation. It's basically SSP3. The one in the middle is a world that continues to muddle through, SSP2, and the one on the right is a world aiming to sustainable development. I find this quite useful because it shows you immediately the benefits of adaptation and of mitigation and how critically important it is to address both. We did only 6 embers because that was all we have in terms of projections. We only had a couple of projections for undernutrition. It was not enough to create any embers for. This was evidence-based, it was based on the publications. So more work to be done in this space. In terms then of our health systems and making sure that we're able to be prepared to respond effectively, the World Health Organization has an operational framework. They just revised it. It came out a few weeks ago. On the left, you see the building blocks of health systems. There's activities and everything around, which is really fuzzy, so you can't read it. And on the right is showing how to make our health care infrastructure environmentally sustainable and climate resilient. Worldwide, over 5% of all greenhouse gas emissions come from healthcare. Certainly in the US, there's lots of discussion about how much emissions come from aircraft, and healthcare is 2.5 times as much. We've heard several times about the health benefits of mitigation policies and technologies. This was put together by Professor Catherine Bowen, who's speaking in a concurrent event, looking at different major mitigation policies and quantifying the health benefits. There was a publication last week from Pathfinder, which goes through case studies of also quantifying the health benefits of mitigation policies. So, Kate, you'll have a lot more to look at when it's time for your report. About 80+% of the health impacts of a changing climate are in children. And so when you think about climate change and health, ask that you think about children. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. And now Kate Calvin, who is co-chair of Working Group 3, will tell us about what was done in Working Group 3 in AR6. So please, Kate.
Thank you, Jan. And thank you, Chris. Where you ended is where I will begin. So talking about how mitigation and health interact. And what I'm going to do to start is go through this figure, and I will walk you through it because there's a lot of content on there. This is a figure from Working Group 3, AR6, Chapter 3. It's figure 3.40. And it's giving you a total overview of the linkage between health and climate from a mitigation perspective. So if you look down the left column, these are different interventions that have benefits for both health and climate change. So there's options like producing more renewable energy or reducing solid fuels used for cooking. And those have different impacts that trickle through to benefit health and climate change. One of the ways that mitigation benefits climate change is through reduced warming. And so if you look at the top right corner of this screen, it talks about some of those. So what the effect is through reducing warming or limiting the future warming. And so there are these benefits like fewer deaths and injuries from extreme weather events. And a lot of the things that Chris mentioned about, all the health outcomes that are linked to temperature and increasing temperature exacerbates those challenges. Mitigation would reduce those because it's limiting warming or reducing warming. So that's on the top right of this figure. But then there's, in addition to just limiting the amount of warming, there's also other effects through changes in lifestyle or air quality that can have benefits. So mitigation can also work through those pathways. So it's not just the change in temperature, it's actually how you live or the air you breathe that also has these health effects. And that's what's being shown in the middle here. So things like improved indoor air quality, or reduced heat in urban areas, active transport, and all of those have both health health effects as well as benefits for climate. And so then if you look at the bottom part of the slide, it's giving you some of those health benefits that you get. So better mental health, fewer deaths from extreme heat, less cardiovascular disease, less respiratory disease, lower rates of cancer, and lower rates of obesity. So that's sort of an overview of that. In working group 3 in AR6, we also did some efforts to quantify those. And we did this in a couple of different ways. So I'm going to show 2 different figures here. And there is a lot of content on this. So I'm going to introduce the concept of this figure, and then we will zoom in on that. And so this is a figure from the working group 3 SPM. This is SPM figure 7. And it's looking at mitigation potential of different options in 2030. And so there's options available in different sectors. So it goes through energy, agriculture, buildings, transport, industry, and other. And the width of those bars, the blue, yellow, red bars, is what the mitigation potential is. Again, focused on 2030. If you did this for a different year, you would have different potentials. And the colors are indicating the cost. So blue are things that are costs, lower than the reference, and then they work their way up, where the red is in the $100 to $200 range. And so within each of these, we quantified what is the mitigation potential of each of these options. And some of these are, energy system options like wind or solar. But some of these are options that also are health related. And so I'm just going to zoom in on the agricultural bar just to give an example here. But if you look at the very last bar here, shift to balanced, sustainable, healthy diet. So this is a shift in your diet that also has mitigation benefits. So it can reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And this is showing you the potential of that. And there are a few other options when you go through this figure that are related to that. So things like active transport, so walking and biking, that has both health benefits as well as mitigation. And we've quantified the mitigation potential of those options in there. The other way that Working Group 3 looked at this was taking all of the different mitigation options that I just mentioned and now looking at trade-offs with sustainable development. And so these are the sustainable development goals. Again, a very small figure, so we're going to walk you through it a little bit. But across each of these bars is a different sustainable development goal. And goal number 3 is related to health. And so we can look at, for each of these individual options, what is the benefit of health for health. And the plus signs are where there are synergies, the minus signs where there are trade-offs, and the dots are where there's either. And there's different pathways through it that were identified in the beginning. So some of these, shifting many of these mitigation actions would have benefits for health through lower air pollution, active mobility, and shifts to sustainable, healthy diet. So those are sort of the 3 of the ways we think about this. One is around air pollution, one is around active mobility and being active, and the other is around the diet. And just on the air pollution, Ida mentioned a lot about air quality, and there's quite a bit of content within AR6 about the links between air quality and health and mitigation and air quality, specifically around methane. And so there is information about, strong reductions in methane can limit near-term warming and improve air quality through reductions in surface ozone. And those can have rather large impacts in the improvement in air quality and health associated with reducing methane. And again, reducing methane is also, we're going to reduce and limit near-term warming. There are other options there that we go through and look at what those what the health benefits are, including combinations of options. So in urban spaces, a combination of electrification, renewable energy, and walkable urban areas can improve health through both improved air quality as well as enhanced mobility. So there's different pathways through that, and looking at how mitigation has these benefits for health. And so with that, I will turn it over to the next speaker.
Thank you, Kate. And then over to David Obura, Chair of IPBES. Please, David. Thanks for joining this event.
Hey, thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. This is my first event, I guess, as chair of IPBES together with IPCC. So very glad to be here and to recognize some familiar faces as well. So we have worked together in some context. I guess we need my slide to come up. Oh, don't have it. Okay. Oh, I sent it. I did actually send it quite late, so I didn't check. Okay. Okay, thanks. Well, as it comes up, I think I can speak to the first couple of slides, and I think what I'll do is first couple of slides just provide a bit of overview of IPBES's approach to assessments, which has been different from IPCC's and not having the regular cycles. And I think in the early days of IPBES, early work on pollination was the first assessment that we did, and then also recognizing that we needed to advance procedures on scenarios and models. So that was the second assessment. And then realizing the complexity of biodiversity and ecosystem services was a focus on 4 main regions that around the world from a biodiversity perspective, and then the global assessment, which was came out in 2019. And that was really the first, I think, the big report that IPBES has put out, and that is now being about to have a second global assessment is in the making. Was decided at the last plenary of IPBES, and I was talking about the sort of complementarity between some of the IPBES processes and IPCC that we could look into in the future. The scoping for experts for the nominations for experts for the second global report has already closed, actually, but the actual scoping process will move forward in the next few months. So I think it might be worth looking at how we can align some of that with the AR7 cycle. I think would be very useful in the coming year, and something for the secretariats perhaps to work on the details of how that may happen within our various complementary procedures. After the second global assessment, pointed to, of course, the great importance of climate change, interactions between biodiversity and climate, which of course we all know is very critical. But our assessments do show how dire the situation is. And that really points to the need for perhaps new approaches. And we took advantage of a workshop process between IPCC and IPBES to undertake what was not a full assessment. So the report didn't go to a plenary. Thank you very much for getting that up. But the fault of that was, of course, in me sending it quite late in the whole process. So I do appreciate getting that through. Let's see. Where should I point at? Over there. Okay. Computer. Okay, so I'll jump through to this slide. So in 2021, of course, the COVID pandemic got in the way of the process. So it was in 2021 when we started the process for this joint workshop report between IPBES and IPCC. And at the same time, during the pandemic in 2020, a workshop report on the pandemic was instituted at the same time. Perhaps not a coincidence that this is really the topic of this session right now, of the interactions between biodiversity, climate, and disease, and how important these interactions are in global society now and down to local levels. I'll tie this into an ongoing assessment right now, which is a Nexus assessment, which I was a co-chair of until I became the chair of IPBES, because IPBES separates the governance and the scientific process. So I've had to give that up to be the overall chair. But the Nexus assessment looks at biodiversity and climate, but then also water, food, and health. And we have a CLA amongst us. So Debbie is here, which is great to have you listening to this. And you can correct me if I say something wrong, because now I'm not inside that assessment anymore. So these are really the foundations for what I'll talk about here now. From the global assessments, 2 messages came out very strongly, pulling some topics that came into the summary for policymakers. So the importance of intact biodiversity, intact natural systems. So conserving biodiversity supports mitigation and adaptation to climate change. Now, the amount of that support, of course, is a topic of very active research, and I think is reported in both IPCC and in IPBES frameworks. Of course, it's very dependent on how much climate change we undergo, and hence the importance of minimizing the amount of climate change that we go through. And then another message, of course, that nature underpins all dimensions of human health and contributes to material, economic, and non-material aspects of quality of life, which are also very important in terms of mental health and people's well-being, as Chris was pointing out. Sorry, yes, I see how sensitive it is. So in the SPM, the section D of the global assessment, just pointing out, looking at the sustainable development goals, a bit of a narrative, and I just pulled out the goals that are mentioned in that text of the summary for policymakers, pointing out these 4 sustainable development goals that biodiversity is critical for in terms of reducing poverty, healthy diets and human health in general, energy, innovation, sustainable communities and cities, sustainable production, consumption, and climate action. But one of the things that I have really come to look at, and I hope we bring forward very well in the Nexus assessment, is that really you can build a narrative from all of the sustainable development goals in terms of the connectivity with others, and that we use the sort of home goal that we're based in, whether from my point of view, that's biodiversity, to look at all the other goals and how biodiversity is impacted by or supports success in those other goals. Some messages from the workshop report on climate change, the 2 workshop reports. So these build very much on the platform from the global assessment and moving forward from that, from 2019 into the challenges of 2020. Looked at 2 very high top global priorities and emerging challenges in which the causal linkages were quite clear. And also the outputs from these workshop reports really informed the scoping for the Nexus assessment, which I'll finish with. Some of the main findings from the Climate Biodiversity Joint Report, I think I'm sure all are familiar with these. The main point here being the importance of mutual interactions between biodiversity and climate actions. That not all actions from one sector might be beneficial for the other. So the importance of really planning with all potential synergies and trade-offs in mind. And of course, in thinking about health, the importance of expanding the scope of considerations to assessing impacts on health as well. That's very much the framing of the Nexus assessment, to look at how any actions from one element impact on other elements, so that there are no unintended consequences. And that's very important in moving forward with planning. In the Climate Biodiversity Report, we came up this multifunctional seascapes figure, and I've seen this used quite a lot subsequently. And this is where really emphasizing the importance of a spatial approach, that there's no empty space anymore on the planet. We need to really work towards 100% spatial planning on land and on the oceans, freshwater systems as well. So we are really considering human society in relation to all these various dimensions. And this really leads towards sort of an ecosystem or a landscape, seascape health type approach. And of course, as we scale up to global systems towards planetary health and being quite conscious of planetary limits now as we're exceeding many of those boundaries. And then coming to this climate resilient development pathways figure, this is how it was depicted in the joint workshop report. Of course, in the AR6 report, we've expanded the scope of this concept. We are incorporating it in the Nexus assessment in various ways. I like this figure from the joint workshop report, particularly thinking about multiple sectors and strands. How, if we think of those different colors as different elements we might be looking at, whether it's climate, biodiversity, health, or other sectors, that those positive pathways are where they are tightly interwoven and planned very well together, and the negative pathways are those where we might have very narrow sectoral planning in any one of them. Right. The pandemics report really emphasized how pandemics are really, of course, the microbes are part of ecosystems, part of daily life. But it's these anthropogenic environmental changes, including climate change, that really lead to imbalance and spill over of microbes from one compartment to another, eventually resulting in zoonotics. Some of them can do that. And then trying to move forward. Oh, I went too far forward. I think what I'll do, I'll just finish with the last slide that I had on the Nexus assessment, because that's where we are right now. And it's important because it's an opportunity to sort of align and bring some of our work programming together across IPCC and IPBES. The external review is open right now until the 14th of January. And so we really welcome members from IPCC and authors from the various components to sign up and give us your comments so that we can incorporate those. So, and there was a URL at the bottom, but it seems to have dropped off, but I'm sure you can Google it like that. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. And I'm sorry about the confusion with the slides, and thanks for your flexibility to improvise. Thank you very much. And now my colleague, Sherry Harper, Vice Chair in Working Group 2, will open the discussion within the panel and also with the audience. So please use this opportunity to bring up issues and discuss with this panel. Over to you, Sherry. Thanks for doing the moderation.
Wonderful. Okay, so we just went on a journey, not only across working groups, but also across international assessments, exploring how climate change and health are integrated across the working groups and across these different assessment processes. It's interesting because on one hand, we saw how Working Group 1 outlines these different climate impact drivers and how they're impacting health, which is covered in Working Group 2, and how we can start to adapt to some of those. And then in Working Group 3, that thread was picked up on because a lot of those adaptation strategies have co-benefits, and a lot of mitigation strategies also have a lot of health co-benefits. At the same time, we also know, like the health sector is responding to these climate change impacts, but the health sector is also contributing to climate change in and of itself. And so the health sector is in this very tricky position because on one hand, they're having to respond to climate change impacts. And on the other hand, they're also understandably under increasing pressure to reduce their emissions. And then what I really loved at the end is how we learned about how biodiversity really underpins all of this and how a healthy climate also underpins biodiversity itself. So there's lots of interconnections, not only across working groups from a health perspective, but also across assessment processes. I thought the example of heat was a really nice one that we saw across the presentation. So we learned about how we're seeing, heat island effects in cities in Working Group 1. We also learned about how we're seeing increased extreme heat events from Working Group 1. Chris presented on how we're starting to see those manifest in terms of, morbidity and mortality, and she showed some burning embers around that, even taking into consideration adaptation strategies, looking at how those impacts are projected to increase. And then we also saw some co-benefits from Working Group 3 on heat-related interventions. The thing that I think is really helpful is to realize the power of framing climate change through a health lens. There's actually some research showing that if we frame climate change through a health lens, it can actually inspire climate change action. So this research compares, framing climate change as an environmental issue versus a national security issue versus a health issue. And what several studies have found over and over again is that if you frame climate change as a health issue, you're more likely to inspire climate change action than these other areas. So that tells me that it's not only important to understand the science behind climate change and climate change impacts on health, but also how we can harness that climate change and health science to help promote action. So if we can, underpin some of these climate change and health messages with really solid science and really solid assessment processes, then I think that we have some really powerful levers or mechanisms at our disposal to try and, move the dial on climate change action. So that brings us to the very beginning of our session when Ramon really pointed out the importance of the topic of health in the 7th assessment cycle for the IPCC. So that is where I'm going to pose my first question to the panel, and then I'll turn it over to all of you. So while I'm posing this question, think about questions in your own mind that you can ask of the panel yourself. But my question is, in the 7th assessment cycle, how do you see opportunities to increase interaction across working groups, but also across international assessment processes? Panel, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Shirley. And I would add to that, across the sectors within each of the working groups, that the structure of the IPCC assessment reports have been set for quite some time. And it'll be quite interesting to hear what's going to happen in the panel meeting in January about this upcoming assessment. Because every time there are proposals to say we need to integrate. And that integration made progress in the AR6, but there's a lot more progress that needs in the AR7. We shouldn't be talking about food security separate from health. The list goes on, and finding ways to help promote that. There's been suggestions for multiple assessment cycles of thinking about not the standalone chapters the way we see them now, but to take on big nexus issues. And to have the nexus issues then be the chapters. And so you can have water, energy, agriculture, and health as a joint assessment. And that would then facilitate the integration that we desperately need. It would inform the funders of where the critical gaps are, because much of what we need to understand is falling between where different funders put their investments. And I think that might be a real opportunity across the working groups, but also across the sectors. Kate?
Yeah, thanks. So I think a lot of, what's going to happen in the 7th assessment report cycle is still to be determined. So in the panel meeting that Chris mentioned in January is when we'll decide the rest of the reports for the cycle. There is already a process underway to develop a special report on climate change in cities. That was agreed to in the last cycle, and we're pursuing that now. And that is a cross-working group report. So all 3 working groups are engaged scientifically in the development of that report. But we haven't had the scoping meeting yet, so we don't exactly know what the content will be. And we don't know what will happen beyond that report yet. But I will just say, we were elected at the end of July, and the co-chairs of the 3 working groups have spent quite a bit of time together since then, and we're all very invested in working more closely together. There were a lot of interactions during AR6. A lot of those were sort of informal. Chris, as a working group 2 author, worked on the working group 3 health assessment. And that was a way of engaging, but it was sort of a reach out to the people that are working in the other working groups in some areas. And I think there's an interest in formalizing that and building those bridges. And it's great to have someone from IPBES on here and try to think through how can we collaborate more closely.
Yeah, in working group 1, there was in the 6th assessment cycle a new chapter 12, was aimed to be a bridge between working group 1 and working group 2. But in this cycle, we hope that having a scoping at the same time would help to have a better alignment between working group 1 and working group 2. But I would think also having literature that use, for example, the same collocated data between working group 1 type of data and working group 2 and health would help also. And I think it's very difficult. For example, in our region in Africa, we have a lot of data related to communicable disease, but not much data on non-communicable disease, while we have more parameters, physical parameters, like temperature that we don't have a match between the impact and the physical parameters.
Okay, thank you. So if I talk from outside IPCC into the IPBES connection. So I see three ways actually in the short term that we might be able to connect, and that I hope we really can move forward on. One is that, the scoping processes are open for AR7, so in the coming year, and we'll be doing the scoping for the second global assessment from IPBES. So I hope there can be some way of having some interchange across those, could potentially be very productive. A second, of course, is sharing of authors. We already have some authors who participate in both sets of assessments, and doing that more strategically, perhaps encouraging that, of course, will be one way. And then a third is with the Nexus assessment coming out in end of 2024, the transformative change assessments. Of course, that'll be a year from now. But the Nexus assessment is very focused on tangible response options, such as from health. So we have 5 sub-chapters really focused on actions from each of those sectors that are very Nexy we've been using, but we can't use that in the actual report text itself. And perhaps that can point towards some of the associated reports, perhaps, or maybe towards some more joint activities that are more nimble and fast acting, like we did with the joint report on climate and biodiversity. And of course, transformative change assessment should help with really those climate resilient development pathways, or what that might become in the AR7 process. So certainly look forward to encouraging those.
Wonderful. Okay. Okay, I think it is working. Yeah. Okay, awesome. Wonderful. So I'd like to open it to the audience. Any questions or comments for our panelists?
Thank you, and good morning to all. Hope you're doing well. So just as a follow-up to this last question posed by Sherry, as an author who has had the enormous privilege of being in both assessments, being in the Nexus assessment has really, in one way, felt like an extension of IPCC in terms of developing the different Nexus elements, taking elements of climate resilient development, parts of the feasibility assessment, and system transition. So the question is, beyond what you just mentioned, what role can you propose to us as authors, seeing these linkages into helping bring both together? And here I'll just add a parenthesis that GEO7 kind of copied the Nexus play in some way. So then you add another assessment that has kind of a similar topic, but fortunately Nexus comes out first. So anyways, yeah, what can be a stronger role for us as authors, really writing on these linkages and to help in bringing the process more closely together? Thank you.
I think you answered your own question, Debbie. The more that we produce the literature, the more it's going to be assessed. And there's been just a huge shift in the last 15 years in the scientific community. When you look at who's nominated for any of these reports, there's huge overlap within IPCC of working group 1, 2, and 3. The same people can be in any working group. There's a growing number of people that can be in any working group. And the more we produce that literature, and the more we develop the collaborations that then can have that Nexus literature out there, the job of these 2 organizations is to assess. But that's also a call to the funders. And that's been a real challenge with the funders if they're used to these separate streams. And it's a role then for the organizations to talk to the funders to say, can you move past your narrow mission mandate focus into being more broadly, have a broader perspective on the challenges we're facing this century and how we're going to produce that scientific knowledge that's needed for the ultimate assessments that you will take action on. At least we hope you're going to take action.
Yeah, I'll just build on that. So I think I agree with Chris that, we can only assess the literature that's written. So as all the scientists working in this area, the more you write, the more we have opportunities for. But I think there is a balance between, there are a lot of authors that can do more than one working group or more than one assessment. And we want that as connections, but we also want new perspectives and people coming from the outside to give this sort of diversity of literature and perspectives in that. And so thinking about that as you encounter literature by other people, trying to bring them into the process. And just, one thing to add that is, one of the most important meetings in any process is the scoping meeting, because it sets the tone of the report, what content can be included. And so the more that authors think about trying to, nominate themselves or be able to participate in that can sort of help identify those linkages and what's included. And how you get nominated for a scoping meeting depends on the country you're from, but we can follow up after with what we know about how that works in different parts of the world. But I think that is an important way of sort of identifying those connections, setting the tone of what's in the report for the cycle.
If I can add to what has been said, I agree with those comments strongly. So in IPBES, so one of the components we have is a knowledge gaps component, and so that's a very important part of all of the chapters. And IPBES invests quite strongly in then taking these knowledge gaps from an assessment and putting them out into the donor community. And so identifying what some of these gaps are to point towards integration, I think, is very important. Then the second part of that is with the glossaries that we have, using terminology that converges, I think, is very important. And that's also particularly important in the summaries for policymakers. Once we're getting to the point of this is what the governments are going to talk about and the terms they're going to use, the more we can really push the agenda in terms of the best terminology, what's most accurate, what's most defensible, what's in the literature. And if it's not there yet, then really to promote the science that will help, push that convergence in coming years, I think is very strong.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Any other questions or comments from the audience?
Okay. Thank you very much, Charlie. First of all, I would like to acknowledge first of all, I would like to recognize your presentations, the quality of the presentations, and the topic that you have been presenting. I would like to highlight three aspects that, in my view, are in a way or another related to your presentations, but for you to elaborate some of them, if you consider, first one has to do with expansion in the last few years with regard to the perspective of the One Health in association to this very close direct and indirect connection between human health, ecosystem health, even the planetary health. Second aspect has to do with something what mentioned by Chris with regard to the unequal distribution of impacts. I would say that during the pandemics and after the pandemics, this process has been much more exacerbated. I mean, this unequal distribution of impacts of all this interaction between climate change, biodiversity loss, and also health gaps. And also the third aspect that is mainly related to David's presentation is the importance of going further in the incorporating indigenous and local knowledge that has been an area in which IPBES has been very proactive. The importance of this process for further improving assessment with regard to the interlinkages in this area of the connection between climate change, biodiversity loss, and health problems. So these are the three aspects I would like to put on the table for you to react now or just to consider for the future. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Want me to start? Well, I'm eager to turn it over to the panelists, but a lot of your comments definitely resonated with me. I think, yes, topics like One Health and planetary health and ecosystem approaches to health, I think all of these are incredibly important. And we did see, certainly in Working Group 2, we talked about those types of approaches and the importance of taking that holistic perspective and understanding not only human health, but ecosystem health and animal health and how all of those things are interconnected and interdependent. Your comment on Indigenous knowledge spoke to my heart. It's something that I'm really passionate about. And I think that in AR6 for the IPCC, we made really important steps forward in that, especially for Working Group 2. And there have been published studies actually looking at that and assessing how well we did and how well we did not do, and making recommendations on how to move forward. And so I think that it's going to be really important for IPCC to learn from other organizations like IPBES for sure, but to also build relationships with Indigenous organizations to figure out how to best do that, because it's not just about picking up what IPBES has done and trying to repeat it, but I feel like developing the relationships with Indigenous organizations will be key to actually successfully doing something that works well for IPCC. But yeah, I'm very eager to turn it over to you guys.
Those are great comments. Thank you, Ramon. On the first one, it's been interesting from the health sector that we're the first sector that's come up with various names for transdisciplinary approaches. Not sure why we felt the need to name them, because other sectors do transdisciplinary approaches as well. It's really much more a question of how we can make it work and how can we really integrate across the sectors. Shirley and I had a lovely dinner last night talking about the literature where health doesn't actually include anybody with knowledge about meteorology or climatology. It's a real area where improvement would increase the robustness of research. And it's just a small example. And so I'm stuck less on the name than the process and thinking about ways. And we've talked a little bit about different processes we can use to really promote that. I forgot your second comment already. Equity. So equity is just central to what we think about in health. It's been central to IPCC from the beginning, and how in the next cycle to bring that forward more clearly. And it is a challenge in a report that's written for governments to then talk at the very local level. And it's going to be a challenge with the explosion in the numbers of papers to think about the IPCC is mandated to be comprehensive, but are there ways to get past that so you can bring forward some of the stories so that they're much clearer so government can see really what the consequences are on a fine scale, because that's where the consequences are being felt. The Indigenous knowledge, absolutely agree with that. And I would broaden it. I work primarily in health. I can go and sit with people in ministries of health and you say, this is what's happening with temperature, precipitation change. And they'll say, this is what's going to happen. It's not a scientific assessment. It's an assessment over 40 decades of work in a space. Building managers. Go to talk to building managers about flooding risks. You get incredible depth of perspectives that's not in the literature. And it's another place to think about how to have more outreach. David mentioned workshops. There's ways to think about capturing this richness of our individual experiences and be able to capture those in the report, because those are compelling. And those are really what helps move policy forward.
Thanks. I don't have much to add beyond the previous two speakers, but I would say, I think we're all looking towards how can we integrate and do transdisciplinary, regardless of what it's called. So what can we think about this in a holistic manner, not just within one working group, but also across working groups and across reports. And I think, there's a lot of new literature coming out. So, and I think that's something we're going to need to address, but the more literature we have, the more we can assess, but we do need to think through how can we be both comprehensive and tailored enough that policymakers and decision makers can actually understand what we're trying to convey to them and what's relevant to where they live. And so I think that's something we're going to need to think through, is how to be both comprehensive and capture that whole literature while still speaking to the questions that people have. And just on the Indigenous knowledge, I think we all, I would be really interested in getting more perspectives into the IPCC, whether that's through literature, authors. And I think the more we can represent those perspectives, the better the product that we'll produce is.
Thanks. Okay, if I try and say things without repeating anything, because I agree with all that has been said so far. So one thing, of course, with biodiversity and ecosystem services, so people's relationship with nature, of course, local experience, personal experience, Indigenous knowledge is foundational. So IPBES was able to really focus on that, and perhaps being a very young institution by the time we were starting up, of course, there was great awareness of the need to be fully inclusive. It takes procedural equity, and so IPBES is really invested in how to consult with, bring in Indigenous peoples and local communities beyond the conceptual framework, which incorporates that, but it's how you do it that's very important. And I think lastly, one of the assessments that was just produced, the values assessment, is very useful for that. And really putting out the case that we must consider multiple values. And just by considering multiple values and doing it in the right way, you automatically improve how you deal with different perspectives from people to have a much more equitable and fair outcome. So the methods and the procedures that we use are critically important in how we move forward.
Maybe just to add regarding your question on One Health concept, in IR6 Working Group 1 assess only impacts of CDI's change on that affect human health. So in IR7, we need to consider also CIDs that affect animal health and ecosystems. And that will be done with more integration across working group and also with IPBES and others. And talking about interaction between disciplines, we mentioned health and climate, but I think also from the risk perspective, thinking of the diagram that Chris has shown, we need also to understand more about vulnerabilities of people and ecosystems. So,
Sorry to come back a second time, but I remembered if you look at the US National Climate Assessment that was just released, the human health chapter actually has a video in it. And there's a little video clip and it's a voice of somebody from a vulnerable group talking about their experiences. And nobody mentioned new technologies. So new technologies.
Wonderful. Thank you. Any other questions or comments from the audience? Yes, please.
So my name is Kristin Aunam. I'm at Cicero Center for Climate Research in Oslo. First, I'd just like to applaud the ambition of this session and the vision of having health as a cross-cutting theme across the work packages. I think that's really important. I just have very small comments, related to this, just an encouragement. I think, of course, you're dependent on the papers coming out, but I think it's extremely important to be able to assess the health burden in terms of number of deaths, number of hospitalizations, which can be then applied, for instance, in cost-benefit analysis. And to do that properly, you need to integrate, you need to understand demographics, socioeconomic development, and of course that's in the scenarios. So when the working group 1, for instance, focus on drivers like number of heat days, that's a very good indicator of a risk, but you cannot apply it directly in health impact assessment. At least I'm working on heat stress and health and mortality, and it's a continuous relationship. So it's really important to be able to, so that the information across the work packages makes it possible, or that you reflect the fact that future health burden depends on all these different factors that are really complicated, but you need to take them into consideration to actually say something about the future health burden, the number of deaths, etc. So it's more a challenge than, and of course it depends on paper. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. That's a great question.
You could have answered that. No, thanks. It's a great question. And in fact, the working groups do take this into account. There has been efforts. Health has been incorporated in the IPCC since the second assessment cycle. The first chapter was in the third, was led by Tony McMichael, and he had text in there about these kinds of issues. And ultimately, what is incorporated in the chapter is based on what's in the literature. And so the more that there is publications to be assessed, if the sector could update the quantitative risk assessment from WHO, which is massively out of date and a huge underestimate. There's lots of work that needs to be done. And this is a call to the sector to produce that research so it can be assessed and then accurately reflected in the chapters And that's part of the process, is to have these 2 rounds of reviews that Jan talked about a little bit earlier. And that's a call to the scientific community to engage, whether as an author of a report, a study, as an author in an assessment, or as a reviewer, that you saw the numbers of reviewers that critically rely on the review process to make sure that these assessments do accurately reflect those kinds of issues.
Yeah, and I'll add a little bit to that in that I think that like that is also situated in this larger ecosystem of climate change and health research, which, as Chris mentioned in her presentation, how the health sector has been underfunded in the context of climate change. But I have to say that the climate change and health research area is incredibly underfunded, and Chris has actually published more than one paper showing how that's not just, a figment of our imagination or something that we are anecdotally seeing. It's something that has been quantified and demonstrated over and over again. So yes, these data exist. And there are great researchers doing great work, but we need more. And I think that we're starting to see that change a little bit. We're starting to see more investments in climate change and health research, but not necessarily in the right way yet. So I think that as a research discipline, we have a long way to go to be able to produce that work that can be assessed in these international assessment processes. Yeah.
So just to add to what Sherry had to say, is when you look under the adaptation funds, less than half of 1% has gone to health. I do have multiple publications about how we're underfunded, and every discipline says we don't get enough funding. And so it is challenging to try and communicate how little funding there is. In the US, over the last several decades until now, the funding under NIH for climate change and health has been running at 0.02% of their budget. It's invisible. And it's changed, as you know, in Europe, but that's also a recent change. It's changing in Australia. It's changed somewhat in Canada, but we're coming from a base of almost nothing. And so the proportional increase seems large, but the needs are much larger than that. People are suffering and dying right now from climate change, and we just don't have the investment to be able to understand the vulnerable groups, to be able to put into practice the different kinds of systems we know that will protect and promote health, that we're in a situation that's really quite urgent, that we see the investments that were promised yesterday.
Thank you. David, over to you.
Yes, I just might observe quickly from the Nexus assessment, actually. So we encountered exactly this problem. And, we always consider how little funding there is in our sectors of research. And I'm a coral reef and ocean scientist. And so the amount of funding is tiny compared to terrestrial science, and in environment, it's tiny compared to what there is in health and education. And I was surprised that for the health subchapter that we have, while there is a huge literature on health, there was a very small literature on the nexus interactions with health. And that's an immense gap that there is.
But the investments are even lower in Global South, particularly for some type of health impacts, such as cardiovascular disease, disease relating to air quality. There is no research or no funding on this aspect. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. So I wanted to thank all of you for joining us on this Health Day at COP28. So I hope that you're able to catch additional sessions on the topic of health and climate change. And thanks so much for kicking your day off with us today. Thank you.